In this installment of our ongoing series on the impact of a racist criminal justice system on women of color, I want to delve deeper into a perspective that is often overlooked: the psychological scars an often unfair and at times neglectful system inflicts. It's an aspect of this topic that deserves attention because its consequences are so profound and tricky to assess. How can a mother recover, if at all, after watching police shoot her son in her own home? Or what impact do the deep psychological wounds of having the police ignore the suspicious death of a loved one have on women's lives and their relationships? It is these connections we have to explore and understand if we are truly going to address the underlying bias of the criminal justice system. That's because, in part, the answers we provide are inextricably linked to the impact the system has on our collective psyches. In other words, our undiagnosed suffering. And I'm speaking as a Black woman here. It cannot help but affect how we contend with this issue. That's why today I'm joined by Dr. Patricia Newton. She has studied and treated the consequences of systemic racism. She is a world-renowned psychiatrist who is the CEO and medical director of the Black Psychiatrists of America and received the Lloyd Elin Memorial Award for Lifetime Achievement and was one of Baltimore Magazine's 100 Most Influential Women. She has pioneered combining Western approaches with traditional healing in African and Caribbean nations. Thank you so much for joining me. Dr. Newton, can you tell me a little bit about the psychological challenges and how they differ between Black women and their white counterparts?
Well, in terms of the dynamics of trauma, we're looking at historical trauma in Black women that goes all the way back to the time of the Ma'afa, or the transatlantic slave trade. What we do also know is that there's intergenerational transmission of trauma, and we understand that not only with women, but with offspring in general, that men who have experienced trauma, there are changes within their RNA, which replicates itself and then alters the impact of the unborn child, as well as what is happening to the mother and the fetus in utero. So what we have are issues of compound, complex trauma that affect not only mind, but body and spirit. And so we're looking at neurobiological changes, we're looking at hormonal changes, we're looking at sociodynamic changes. So it's a very complex, not very simplistic kind of mechanism that goes on within a human being. And African women, of course, because they have been subjected to trauma for many, many years historically, and continue to be assaulted on a regular and consistent basis, begin to experience some of the symptoms that combat veterans manifest, and they do it as early as childhood.
I know there have been some recent studies that show that there's actually not just a psychological impact, but a physiological impact when women deal with racism in their everyday life. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah, we look at microaggressions is what we talk about, and what we see are hormonal changes. We see changes in the what we call norepinephrine, the fight-flight symptoms in a person, where they're constantly in an alarm state. The human being is not supposed to stay in that state consistently. You're supposed to raise up for the time of stress, and then it goes back down so you can have a rest period. And what we find is that many trauma victims, and particularly in African American communities, that level of hormone intensification never dips. It stays at a constant high level. And so what you end up seeing is changes in the body's catecholamines that control blood pressure, the body's cortisol level that controls sugar. And so we see many times women having diabetes and hypertensive effects as a result of having experienced that. In addition, we know that women who have been traumatized as children often have more gastrointestinal problems and seem to have more irritable bowel syndromes than women who were never traumatized. And finally, we also know over time, we see changes in the corpus callosum of the brain, the part of the brain that transmits data from one side to the other. It actually shows a smaller size in women who have been traumatized than those who have not.
So you're essentially telling me that women enduring racism on a daily basis, racist policing, is actually affecting the size of their brain?
Well, actually what happens is the trauma effects that racism causes, not racism in and of itself, but the effect that racism creates in terms of how it impacts upon a person's perception of whether they are being traumatized, bullied, whether they're being, discriminated against. And we see changes in the amygdala, that's the portion of the brain that has to do with emotions. We see changes in the corpus callosum. We also see changes in the connections. There's a way that nerve cells communicate, they're called dendrites, and they actually talk to each other. And what we see is changes in those in terms of the decrease in the amount of appropriate communication that occurs within brain cells. And we also know that within the chromosome changes, the end of the chromosomes called telomeres, those are shortened as well. And so what happens is that people begin to have long-term effects of this chronic effect of racism and trauma in general, to the degree that their coping skills become altered. And when they become altered, we then see the other kind of manifestations that occur within how they behave and how they use substances of, illegal and illicit as well as licit, and the kind of interactions. So we see anxiety symptoms. We see an increase in substance use and alcohol use disorders. We see a change in mood. We see affective disorders, so that whole chemical balance that has to do with regulation of mood also becomes altered. So it's not just a singular effect, it's a cumulative effect that occurs over time, because the brain in constant stress and constant trauma doesn't have time to recover. In other words, the battery can't recharge.
Now, you also mentioned, you said telomeres, you talked about this type of trauma affecting men's RNA. Are you saying to me that Black people are passing the trauma on to their children even while they're in their womb?
Absolutely. I am saying that. There's a plethora of research that talks about intergenerational transmission of traumatic effects. And it was first documented with Holocaust victims. And they were able to show that the offspring of Holocaust victims had some of the same anxiety and behavioral patterns that their parents had or their grandparents had, who were part of that stigma of having been put in concentration camps. And even though these offspring never had that experience, they had the same symptoms. And so that early research then has led itself to subsequent research to look at, if you had Holocaust victims having that, it doesn't take a rocket science to figure out what 400 years of bombardment will do to a species of people. And we have enough data to talk about intergenerational transfer of trauma to know very well that many children will manifest symptoms that were inherent in their ancestors. And that's superimposed, of course, upon the social determinants and environmental factors that then come in and weigh in on the genetic predisposition.
For women who go through the prison industrial complex, can you tell me a little bit about some of the stressors they endure and how that affects them when they become returning citizens?
Well, first of all, if we look at some of the data from the Justice Department, what we find is about 7 to 10% of the entire prison population are female. And of that, what we know is that 68% of those women who are incarcerated have been diagnosed with some form of a psychiatric disorder even prior to entering the criminal justice system. And about 32% of those will have very serious psychiatric disorders, as opposed to men, which have about 41% of some experience with psychiatric disorders or behavioral disorders before entering prison, and about 23% are very serious. So what we look at is we see that among African American and Latina women, about 2.5% greater, 2.5 times greater, and 1.4% greater in terms of Blacks versus Latinos, of women who are going to have mental disorders that manifest themselves in jail as opposed to their white female counterparts. And so they come into jail oftentimes already with substance use disorders, already with having been traumatized sexually and maybe even physically, already with certain kinds of dysfunctions in many instances, not all. And then what we see is that the complaints that they raise oftentimes are ignored. and oftentimes not dealt with in the same degree that they are with white females. We know that at least 50% of the white females complain of having psychiatric disorders, although we know that 2.5 times greater the diagnosis has already existed among black people.
So let me ask you something. If black women, women of color, Latino women were able to have better access to mental health care, do you think we would see less of them in the prison system?
I think so, and let me just back up and say that the prison system has become the new mental health hospital. The system was never designed to treat psychiatric illness. It wasn't even originally designed to treat women, let alone psychiatric disorders. And the fact that we still have women shackled when they're giving birth, while they're incarcerated, already sends up a red flag. And so we've got that predisposition. But what we know is that many of the women that come into the criminal justice system have that history of early trauma, have a history of multiple kinds of adverse events and experiences that have occurred with them that make them at greater risk. Most of them, at least half to 75% of them, have never seen a mental health professional. And until they enter the criminal justice system, that may be the first encounter with a mental health professional, if they're able to get one. So yes, the answer is unequivocally that if people were given access to good mental health care, behavioral health care, as children even, and even in adolescents and early adults, the probability of them entering the criminal justice system is probably about threefold less.
I would like to talk to you about a young woman I spoke to named Tiara Kelly. When she was 16 years old, she found out that her mother was found dead in an alley, covered in mulch, partially disrobed, with evidence of trauma to her adrenal glands, and homicide couldn't be ruled out. But her death wasn't investigated. It was placed in the category of undetermined. So her family has to live with what they believe is an unsolved murder. And she found out about her mother's death when she was 16 years old.
She's gone now. I want to know what happened, how it happened. So yeah, I've read that they found her behind a dumpster with her pants down, and her body was decomposed because it was out. I was oh. I was so hurt because you hear stuff like that on TV, you never think it's going to happen to you. Yes, I had to go through therapy for many, many years.
What kind of impact does this have on a young woman? How is she able to move forward with this kind of trauma?
Well, there's a multiplicity of behavioral and psychological issues that impact somebody who has discovered unresolved death. Unresolved deaths among African Americans is not an unusual thing. It happens more likely than not that they're put in what we would call unresolved or undetermined or cold cases or whatever. And so what we know is that one, that's acute trauma. You lose a first degree relative, a child, a parent, something of that nature. That has a greater traumatic impact than, say, a cousin, even though that's still a tragedy. And so what we see are a plethora of emotions. The first one would be anger and disbelief, and how people act out that anger depends on how they have developed coping skills and what kind of nurturing process has occurred for them early on. If they've also not had a good support system, then what we see is people get what I call stuck in neural cement, meaning that they can't move forward, that they focus and they stay where they are, and they get cut off. Their emotional system gets cut off from their frontal lobe, and their frontal lobe is what I like to call the CEO of the brain. It actually makes the difference and help you make the decisions that you need to navigate life and to navigate it successfully. And so when you are traumatized at an early age, then those connections get disrupted. And they get disrupted to the degree that oftentimes your coping skills become inadequate. Anger acts out in many ways. It can be self-destructive behavior in the form of substance use, alcoholism. It can be hypersexuality. It can be constant mood changes that make you a difficult person to deal with. You just become, somebody that nobody really wants to be around. And so all of these have an effect, because to lose a parent and to have that parent die in such a way that you don't get closure any kind of definite closure leaves a void, and that void gets filled in by maladaptive coping mechanisms if there is not an adequate support system or some navigation through a health system that will assist you in learning how to best deal with that reality.
Now, something I noticed when I was speaking with her is that throughout the interview, even though she was talking about very painful issues, she continued to smile, almost as if she was trying to put me at ease. And I wanted to know, even though she said she had been in therapy for many, many years, why would a young woman who had been through so much trauma give off a sense of being smiling or at peace, or that she had some distance from it, when compared to when I spoke with her aunt, who burst into tears when talking about it?
Well, it's a coping mechanism. It's a defense mechanism. It's used as a displacement so that the person that is interviewing them or talking to them is really not conscious of what is going on inside. It's a way of masking my anger. It's a way of masking my depression and my fear, because society is going to be more accepting of you if you smile than if you have an emotional reaction that they consider aberrant.
Greta Carter is another woman I spoke with, and she lived through the horror of watching her unarmed 14-year-old son be shot to death in her kitchen, and she watched him bleed out. This tragedy, this murder, happened at the hands of a police officer that she initially had called for assistance. Can you talk about the impact of such a brutal and tragic loss of a child, and having it happen at the hands of police, as well as in your home, which is supposed to be a safe space?
Well, we have a number of issues to consider. First is the acute traumatic effects of seeing your child murdered, period. And to see them murdered violently to the degree that you can see them bleed. Then you have the long-term effects, which are the post-traumatic stress disorder effects of how you cope with having to deal with loss of a child. Nobody expects their child to go before them. Then when you superimpose that upon police officer, or someone that you view as a helper, someone that will be coming to your aid to assist you if you have a disruption in your home or whatever, and that child gets murdered for reasons that are not clear at this point by that officer, then that becomes a distrust of the police. You also see things that happen in people where they often, when they hear police sirens, they'll start to have anxiety attacks, or they will duck and run and continue to have these kinds of dynamics. There's a lot of anger, and people handle that anger in different ways. She will also feel guilty for an extended period of time, if not the rest of her life, because she called for help from the person who actually killed her son. So that's going to be an internalized guilt that may or may not ever get expressed because she feels responsible for having contributed to her child's death.
Now, you mentioned something interesting in that hearing sirens causes people panic attacks. One of the things we see a lot of times in the news is that when a young black man or woman runs from the sight of police or the sound of police, they are blamed. They're said, you should have respected what the police officer said when he said, stand still, don't move.
Right.
How do you answer that when they say, this person wasn't doing what the police officer told them, but at the same time you're saying it's a very natural reaction to experience anxiety?
Well, it depends on the person. And some people who have been traumatized early in their lives are going to run. Some people are going to freeze and actually do nothing. So it's incumbent upon the people who are making the arrest or attempting to make the arrest to take some level of hesitancy. If you don't see a weapon, there's no really need to actually kill someone or even shoot someone. But we have to take under consideration people who have had a lot of experiences, and when they see police officers, many of them will run no matter what. It's just because they've had relatives or themselves have been subjugated to something negative. Other people will assume that because you run, you're guilty. But if you take a history and you look at if you take 10 people and you say that 5 of them have been traumatized, 3 of them are going to run and 2 of them are going to stay there and just freeze. So you have to look at the dynamics and what the historical realities are of a people. And I know when police officers are making these kinds of split-second decisions, they don't have the luxury always of making that kind of judgment. But if you don't see a weapon, there's no need to kill.
I wanted to ask you another question about Greta Carter. Something she did absolutely amazed me, which is years after the death of her son, she saw the police officer in a 7-Eleven, and she reached out to him and wanted to speak with him, and she offered him her forgiveness. And he said he became very emotional, and she actually embraced him.
On that day, which he may never admit publicly, but in our private moment in the store, in that encounter, he realized in his heart that he did something that was not right. So as I said to him, I forgive you because I don't want God my heart has been so heavy all these years. And in order for me to have a peace in my heart, I forgave him for taking my son's life.
Now, I have seen a lot of examples, for example, in Charleston, South Carolina at the AME church, where Dylann Roof murdered good church-going folks simply sitting in a Bible study, and their family members were willing to extend Dylann Roof forgiveness. Why do so many African American people, in particular African American women, feel that they need to offer forgiveness to those who have so terribly wronged them?
There's a interesting explanation, which is multifactorial. First of all, the African American church has been a stable system within the community from the most adverse times of the slavery period, or the period of enslavement, to the present time. And so many people have a lot of support within that, social support, within that dynamic that allows them to be able to move forward. Coupled with that is in the African church, and maybe in many Christian churches, forgiveness is considered to be part and parcel with what you do in order to claim your place in the higher power or claim your place in heaven. So that this is a kind of a system. And you know, you've got African people that have been forgiving their oppressors since they got off the boat. And so there's also some historical issues. But some people need to do that in order for them to move on. If they say that they believe in a certain faith dynamic, they don't necessarily believe in that parable in the Bible that says eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Some people believe that forgiveness puts them at a higher category for healing. And in some people that is true. In other people it is a form of denial and a form of protection against the pain that they feel that is so overwhelming that if they were to acknowledge it, they would totally decompensate.
I'd like to ask you now about sexual harassment and sexual assault. I spoke with a woman named Tomita Wilson. She lives in Perkins Homes, which is subsidized housing here in Baltimore City. And she was stalked by one of the maintenance men. She was afraid to even come out of her house for fear that he would be sitting there waiting for her, which he often was. Another maintenance worker coerced her into giving him sexual favors for needed maintenance repairs in her home. Her home was invaded by pests, had lost electricity, so her refrigerator wasn't working. She had many things that were going wrong with her home, and the maintenance worker said, I have done certain service for you. You now have a bill with me. Now you owe me something in exchange. And so in order to essentially get these services for her and her child, she gave into this sexual extortion.
I was in an uncompromised position. I had to do what I have to do in order to pay that bill. He just stated that we can clear the bill up if you perform a sexual act with me.
This happened in other subsidized housing in Baltimore City. This happened in Gilmore Homes. How is a woman supposed to process this kind of environment in which you're essentially prey to the men that are there?
Well, you have to also look at historically what her experience has been. whether or not this lady had been sexually harassed since childhood, whether she was abused as a child, and whether or not she developed a mechanism of coping that would allow her to surrender rather than report that kind of situation. Because what we're dealing with also is the issue of poverty and the issue and the impact that poverty has on the decisions that people make. Many women have been guilty, as you want to call it, or have committed the act of being responsible to coercion because they have children and they have limited resources and there's no male around to take advantage of that, and because when they do file complaints, no one listens. And
Or
so,
it could actually affect her being able to keep her home.
absolutely, absolutely, because people do lie, and they, and this was a maintenance man. So the reality is that oftentimes it's important to tell someone else what is going on with you, and to get support from other women, because I'm sure she's not the only one in that particular complex that has had to be subjected to that. So if women band together and begin to realize that they are not alone, that they're not isolated, it's the hash me too, right? Dynamic. And so there's power in strength. And so people, when they do that, oftentimes are feel isolated, feel they have no other alternatives, don't have any male support, don't necessarily call on their male relatives because you don't know what those relationships have been. But it's important to speak up and speak out and to get other people to acknowledge it. And if they do attempt to remove you, you've got something on record that will allow you to take these people to court. And let me add to that. The process of coping and empowering yourself to take these actions usually occur in people who have not been so traumatized. It usually takes a while before traumatized people will come forward to take care of themselves. That's what I meant by that whole neural cement. You just revert back to survival mode. Your brain goes back to the old reptilian portion of the brain where it's either fight or flight. And so they acquiesce because they don't see any other alternative, and they want to provide a safe haven for their children. And we have to begin as a community to support people and recognize that women oftentimes who are heads of household, who have children and there's no male around, are sometimes the most vulnerable within our community in terms of how they can access support. And that would have been an opportunity to go to a local community center or a church and ask for support, and to get them to come in to that management office of that particular project and to investigate and either terminate those maintenance workers and offer support for her if she needs some legal assistance.
I think that's such excellent advice to say that women need to tell each other what's going on and share their experiences, and then to bond together and say, we're going to go down to that office with
Absolutely.
you, and we're going to support you every step of the way.
Absolutely, that's power and strength.
Now, I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about something a little bit different, which is the inundation of videos of violence against Black bodies that we've been seeing on social media. Essentially, you can go on your Facebook, go on your Twitter feed, and be surprised by seeing this terrible image of a Black man being shot in the back, or a young Black girl being violently wrestled to the ground, or a grandmother standing in the middle of a highway having her arm broken by a police officer. We see these terrible, violent images. What kind of impact is this having on the African American community when these places that we're going just to check in with our friends, we're suddenly seeing all these images of violence against our own people?
Well, it depends on the age of the person as well, because if children are constantly watching this, we see alterations in their brain chemistry, but we also see something behaviorally where it becomes normative. In other words, where people begin to adapt and expect that to occur. The great thing, though, it's a double-edged sword. The great thing about having disposal of iPhones and these things to record these incidents is that it brings them to light, because there's certain segments of our population that never believe these things occur. But to have them constantly repetitive over and over and over and repeated then creates a dynamic of trauma that has to be addressed. And if there's no outlet, see, it's important when these things happen in our communities to have, whether you're in PTA groups, your church groups, your social club groups, whoever you hang out with, to begin the dialogue and discuss some of these issues and take some action. It's the absolute helplessness of the situation that creates more anxiety, more depression, and more trauma to the viewer than if they are able to empower themselves to take some kind of action.
You know, I think you really hit on it there, because a lot of the women that I speak with, sometimes we feel so helpless, like there isn't anything we can do. And I think trying to combat that is so important.
It's essential to the survival of your sanity, to the health and safety of your community, and to the well-being of your children.
Recently, Baltimore citizens watched Deshaun McGreer get badly beaten on Rosa Monument Street. We saw him his head hit white marble steps. We saw blood pour out of his mouth. The whole city witnessed this terrible video and this terrible trauma that happened to this young man. How do you think a community, how it affects them psychologically to see this kind of brutality, to experience this kind of brutality on a daily basis? How does it affect our psyche as a community?
Well, it's a trauma. It's a trauma. You see, the thing about a post-traumatic stress disorder is that you don't have to be the victim. You can be witnessing it and still have the experience of the trauma. It also is a symptom of the effect of feeling dehumanized, and how, in fact, the community feels as though they're dehumanized as a result of these kinds of blatant, inappropriate actions that are being carried out in the name of law and order. It should empower people rather than paralyze them, but we know that trauma victims become paralyzed and often do nothing and say nothing, but internalize it, and it affects their mind, body, and their spirit. So what I am encouraging, people to do is, when they witness these kinds of things, to get with their social network, to get with their group, empower themselves to call people to task, call politicians to task, call anybody that has anything to do with how these kinds of behaviors are permitted to continue, to make them accountable. And if they're not accountable, to make sure you put people in place in offices and in positions of power that will take it under consideration. That's what empowerment does. And that's a healthy response. You don't go out and necessarily bang up somebody's head because of what they did. You empower yourself to take charge and recognize that as long as you're breathing and there are other folk breathing with you, you have the power to make change.
Well, I think that's an incredibly strong note to end on. Thank you.
You're welcome.